welcome to you all. It's great to see you all here, and welcome to everyone online. My name is Mark Cornwall from the History Department. I've been organising this lecture since 2012. So this is the 12th Southampton Stonewall Lecture. And also this year, this is a joint event with our new Centre for Eastern European and Eurasian Studies here at Southampton University. We've had many illustrious speakers here for the Stonewall Lecture over the years. We've had George Chauncey talking about gay New York, Laura Doan talking about the significance of Alan Turing, Bruce Smith, who turned to talking about gay Shakespeare. And 2 years ago, we heard the American historian Howard Chang speak about the trans history of East Asia. And last year, we had Professor Matt Cook, who was talking about queer lives in Britain since gay liberation. The name of our Stonewall Lecture series comes firstly from the historic Stonewall riots, which erupted in New York in 1969 and were a kind of seismic moment. And secondly, because we are proud to link ourselves to the UK's Stonewall charity, which in the last 30 years has done so much to transform LGBTQ lives across the UK. And I'm sure you know this, but the purpose of our annual lecture is threefold, really, and I always say this. Firstly, to explore our rich LGBT heritage and present cutting-edge research on LGBT or queer history. Secondly, to promote our university values of equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And it's great that EDI is actually starting to blossom in our school and our Faculty of Humanities here. And thirdly, to understand our modern world in all its diversity through educating ourselves about the queer past. And those of you who regularly attend the lecture will know that our aim is to make the lecture series as diverse as possible, covering different periods of history, the full range of queer lives and experiences around the world. And I think this is very much reflected in the choice of our speaker tonight. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Charlie Walker, who's going to introduce the speaker.
Thanks, Mark. So, Professor Dan Healy is Emeritus Professor of Modern Russian History at the University of Oxford. He is the leading historian of the LGBTQ history of Russia. In 2001, he published his groundbreaking book on the subject, Homosexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia, the Regulation of Sexual and Gender Dissent. As the first full-length history of sexuality in Russia, it opened up a huge range of scholarship on a very neglected subject. Dan's other major publications include the books Bolshevik Forensics, Diagnosing Disorder in the Clinic and Courtroom from 2009, and Russian Homophobia from Stalin to Sochi from 2017, which one reviewer praised as follows. This is a stunning accomplishment filled with original research on topics as diverse as institutionalized sex and power dynamics in the Gulag camps. Throughout, Dan Healy shows why he is the leading historian of Soviet sexuality writing today by demonstrating how fully understanding Soviet history means studying it through a queer lens. General interest readers looking for a well-researched history of the current discrimination in Russia will find Healy's book a must-read. So on that note, it's good news that there are lots of flyers over there if anyone's interested in buying the book afterwards. Dan took a degree in the Russian language at the University of Toronto and then gained his degree there in 1998. However, he's been living and working in the UK for 40 years, and apart from the University of Oxford, where he's based at St Anthony's College, he's taught at the universities of Glasgow, Swansea and Reading. In terms of current research, he's just finishing a book about doctors in the Gulag in Stalin's Russia for Yale University Press, and he also continues to research queer history in the non-Russian speaking republics of the former Soviet Union, including Georgia. And in connection with that, he's currently in charge of the Oxford Georgian Studies Programme and is learning the Georgian language, I hear. So he's following the tradition of emeritus professors, taking on bigger and bigger challenges and going from strength to strength. So without further ado, Dan, to you.
Success. Great. Thank you very much, Charlie and Mark. And
Also, Louise and George, for your support in organizing this year's Stonewall Lecture. I've been a friend of the Stonewall Lecture for a very long time, and it's a real privilege and honor to be asked to speak today. I will begin and launch straight in. A little over a year ago, on the 24th of February 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Despite a drumbeat of warnings for months from Western intelligence services, most observers and many experts thought a full invasion was unlikely. Russian President Vladimir Putin had amassed military forces on the borders of Ukraine, apparently seeking to destabilize the Kyiv government through intimidation. Perhaps Ukraine's comedy actor turned president Volodymyr Zelensky would take fright and abandon Ukraine to pro-Russian leaders. Indeed, once the invasion was underway and columns of tanks were bearing down on the Ukrainian capital, many commentators expected the Ukrainian government to collapse within days. It did not turn out that way, as we all well know now. Ukrainians resisted Russian aggression, and Zelensky's leadership and skilled communications inspired his country's people and Western sympathy. Russia has thrown itself into a conflict that will be protracted and bloody, and that will profoundly transform the societies of both Russia and Ukraine. On the day he sent Russian forces into Ukraine, President Putin gave a speech that set out the objectives of his so-called special military operation. He said he aimed to deter Ukraine from joining NATO, which had done nothing but take advantage of weakened Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The speech gives a tendentious and resentful potted history of the failure of the Soviet Union, the plight of Russia in the 1990s, and the ways that NATO has acted unilaterally in global politics since then. Extension of NATO membership to Ukraine was the final straw. It would create an anti-Russia on Russia's doorstep. Putin repeatedly characterized the popularly elected government of Ukraine as being extreme nationalists and neo-Nazis. He declared that his goal was the, quote, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, end quote. It might seem that Putin's objectives have little to do with LGBTQ politics, and still less with queer history. And yet, in a critical section of his 24 February speech, he alluded to LGBTQ politics and history in a passage dwelling on Russia's travails in the 1990s and the West's allegedly hostile influence. At that time, the Russian Republic of Chechnya was at war with Moscow. The West supposedly supported Chechen separatism in Putin's view, and in his words, the West tried to put the final squeeze on us, finish us off, utterly destroy us, end quote. His speech then quickly turned to link these military and terrorist assaults on Russia to a subtler threat, one of existential destruction. And he says, the West sought to destroy our traditional values and force on us their false values that would erode us, our people, from within, the attitudes they have been aggressively imposing on their own countries, attitudes that are directly leading to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. This is not going to happen. No one has ever managed to do this, and they won't succeed now. End of Putin's quote. Although he didn't mention LGBTQ identities explicitly, Putin was using code words any Russian TV viewer would understand. Traditional values, opposing false values that are against human nature. Coded language referencing a narrative of official homophobia he has been using for years. Western influence in Russia was entirely responsible, he has argued, for the importation of LGBTQ lifestyles and identities previously supposed to be alien to Russia. The West's assault on Russia was not just strategic via NATO expansion.
but a form of biological propaganda against Russia's dwindling population. The false values of modern Europe that Putin gestured to were tolerance of queer citizens and the extension of rights to such citizens like human rights protection and partnership recognition. The creation of an anti-Russia in a Europe-facing Ukraine by a freely elected government that accepted cultural and social pluralism was intolerable to Putin and his elite. For them, the Ukrainians are junior partners in their imagined Slavic civilization, a single people consisting of the Great Russians, the White Russians of Belarus, and the Little Russians, the Ukrainians. Fighting for so-called traditional values against false values of gender and sexual equality is, by now, a 20-year feature of Putin's political narrative. The nature of Russia's politics of homophobia has changed over these years. It has evolved and transformed from a domestic political tool useful to the Kremlin as it sought to stabilize Russia and consolidate power, to a soft power appeal to anti-liberal political forces in Russia's neighborhood, and indeed in Europe and beyond. Now, with the full-scale war on Ukraine, the Kremlin's homophobia has taken on a darker, hard power significance. As you will see, Russian state homophobia is now an official security priority. In this Stonewall Lecture, I will trace the history and evolution of Putin's homophobic campaign inside Russia, starting with the Soviet legacy and post-Soviet backdrop, before turning to speak more broadly about how conservative forces mobilized anti-LGBTQ narratives in the Putin era. I want to explore the historical roots of the Kremlin's official homophobia and ask why it resonates so much with ordinary Russians. To begin with a few points of clarification. The first is about the focus of this lecture, that this lecture throws on Russia and its homophobia. By doing so, I am not forgetting that prejudice against same-sex love and gender diversity is universal, right here at home in the UK, and alive and well in our NATO allies' societies too. A different lecture about the history of official homophobia in the United Kingdom would take us through a story at least as old as the Reformation, the rise and fall of the British Empire, socialist and capitalist attempts to purify British society, Margaret Thatcher's Section 28, and our current government's efforts to trigger and exploit a culture war between advocates of trans and women's rights. So while deploring the persecution of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and trans people in Russia, we should remember that we have our own histories to reflect upon too. Another point is about Ukraine. I am principally an expert on Russia and won't be saying very much about the queer history of Ukraine itself. I am a product of Western Cold War and post-Cold War academic training that emphasized the view from Moscow, and I'm still working to decolonize my perspectives on the non-Russian countries which were part of the old Soviet Union. In fact, Ukraine's LGBTQ history still remains under-researched and little explored. But a younger generation of activists and scholars are starting to write these histories now. Soon we will know more about queer lives and homophobia in this country, which has so often been divided between different empires and different blueprints for the future. So turning to look at the Soviet legacy. Russia's experience of dealing with homosexuality and gender variance was radically different from that of Western countries. To understand why homophobia is so powerful in Russia today, we have to look more closely at this experience. The 1917 Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin's rule, and then Stalinist and late Soviet totalitarianism all had an impact. During and after the revolution of 1917, Lenin's communists used gender politics as a political battering ram to undermine the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was arguably the new revolutionary Soviet government's most dangerous opponent, an alternative vessel for the nation, if you like. The church regulated family life and sexuality in old Tsarist Russia, and male homosexuality was both a sin and a crime. Female homosexuality was not criminalized under the Tsarist regime, but it was certainly viewed as a sin. Lenin's communist regime proclaimed a sexual revolution that aggressively secularized family law, gender rights, and laws on sexual life. The communists drew upon 19th century European socialist ideas of atheism, of the end of patriarchal male domination, of free love, and life governed by science, born in the socialist parties of urban Germany and France. They imposed their sexual revolution on the population of Soviet Russia, an overwhelming majority of which were peasants steeped in religion, patriarchy, and rigid family morality. Lenin enacted secularized marriage, radically liberalized divorce, and equalized women's legal status in family and public life. Communist secular and scientific values also led to the legalization of abortion in 1920, and male homosexuality in 1922 was decriminalized. Lenin and the communists said very little about their policy on homosexuality. We know from letters and private diaries and memoirs that socialists and some lesbians, gays, and trans people in early Soviet Russia believed that the sexual revolution included their kind of love. But this major victory for LGBTQ people in the world's first revolutionary socialist state was a precarious game and poorly understood by the vast majority of communists drawn from the ranks of soldiers, workers, and peasants. The birth of modern Russian political homophobia came with the rise of Joseph Stalin to absolute power in the 1930s. The Stalin ruling group's campaigns for forced collectivization of peasant agriculture and five-year plan industrialization created the social upheaval that was the backdrop for renewed persecution of male homosexuals. In 1933-34, the secret police were engaged in filtering the inhabitants of the Soviet Union's major cities, issuing ID documents and expelling undesirables. On political charges, they arrested hundreds of gay men. The police believed that they were spies for Nazi Germany and agitators against Soviet power. Stalin proposed that these scoundrels must receive exemplary punishment and ordered a new law against male homosexual acts be drafted. Stalin personally edited the text to make sure homosexuals would be sent to the harshest forced labor gulag camps in the farthest north and the farthest east of the country. For the Soviet gay socialists who believed the revolution included their love, the change came as a bewildering shock. The change came as a bewildering shock. Harry White was a gay communist journalist from Edinburgh, living in Moscow and working at the time for the Moscow Daily News, an English language Soviet newspaper. From the moment homosexuals started being arrested, White began asking co-workers, experts, and even the secret police why this was happening. Not getting the answers he sought, in May 1934, White dared to write a long and sophisticated letter to Stalin himself, challenging the dictator to explain the basis for the new anti-homosexual law. It's a remarkable fact of queer history that Stalin read this letter, underlining passages, and saved it for posterity. White gave a Marxist defense of what we would now call LGBTQ liberation. Stalin wrote across the top of the page, "To the archive, an idiot and degenerate." White was soon expelled from the Soviet Union, and other Soviet opponents of the law were crushed and silenced. With Stalin's new anti-homosexual law, surveillance of gay men became a routine part of secret and regular police work. Historians can document at least 38,000 cases of arrest and conviction under Stalin's law over the 60 years it was in force. The complete total is probably more like 50 or 60,000, in fact. Stalin and the police did not view lesbians as a security threat to the same degree, but we know of some cases where women were persecuted when their relationships were uncovered. Soviet society changed rapidly in the decades after Stalin's death in 1953. But the anti-homosexual law remained in effect, despite arguments behind closed doors about decriminalization among experts and police. In Stalin's Gulag, both male and female queer relations had been particularly visible and notorious. The release of over 1 million Gulag prisoners in the 1950s led to fears that homosexuality from the camps was infecting civilian society, and it contributed to a surge of popular homophobia. Psychiatrists tried to develop conversion therapy for both male and female homosexuals, and doctors were required to report to police any cases of homosexually transmitted sexual infections. Homophobia was also rife in the conscript Soviet army, where all young men had to serve for 2 years, and in the workplace, where party surveillance was quick to persecute lesbian and gay relationships. Near universal rates of young marriage and a housing shortage made in the 1980s a surprisingly rich underground lesbian and gay subculture existed in most Soviet big cities, and the stage was set for a change once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And this is just a picture of the Bolshoi Theater, which everyone knows, but fewer people know that the little park in front with the fountain and the shrubs was the key cruising site, the sort of epicenter of queer Moscow and a gathering spot, just opposite the monument to Karl Marx. So the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, but why does that happen? Let's look at that story. Can I? No. Oh, I can't now move the slide on.
You click that.
Click which?
Just click, just one click mouse.
No, it's not doing it. How can I get rid of this?
It's not shooting.
Was it there before?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's there from the beginning.
Oh, I apologize.
Where is that? There we go.
Ah,
That one you may have to drag. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So looking at post-Soviet problems, from about 1987, when the Soviet leadership began to embrace political reform and democracy, to 2000, when Putin came to power, Russia experienced the most traumatic years of economic and geopolitical weakness it had known in modern times. It was also a period of exhilarating free speech, political contestation over the memory of Soviet violence and Stalinist totalitarianism, and a time when previously silenced national and sexual minorities found their voices. All of this turbulent change came alongside a turbocharged dash to privatize huge state industries and assets and recreate a market economy according to Western expert advice. Millions felt poorer, and a tiny handful of oligarchs got extremely rich thanks to transitional economics. In the late 1980s, before the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union, Russian queer men and women were not mere victims of widespread homophobia. More and more, they were aware of the rise of Western gay and lesbian activism and safer sex campaigning around the AIDS and HIV crisis. They sought ways to adapt some of these liberating ideas to the Soviet context. Soviet democratization allowed LGBTQ people to organize conferences, festivals, and ultimately face-to-face exchanges and collaboration with Western LGBTQ and feminist activists. But the influence of the West in these exchanges should not be exaggerated. Most Russian LGBTQ activists publishing newspapers and magazines, forming self-help groups, setting up clubs or social events, did not meet with Western activists, who generally stuck to Moscow and St. Petersburg and shared a narrow clutch of contacts. From 1990, when the first proud gay and lesbian news magazine, The Theme, which is here in the slide, appeared in Russia, an explosion of hard copy print media An explosion of hard copy print media for gay men and lesbians took off across the country, and it was almost entirely homegrown in content and interests. Post-Soviet Russia's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans communities and their concerns were made in the USSR and were not some kind of foreign import. After the collapse of communist rule in 1991, the Russian LGBTQ community called for the end of Stalin's anti-homosexual law. It was finally abolished in 1993 in Russia. In fact, each republic of the old Soviet Union inherited the law, and Ukraine was the very first to get rid of it in 1991. Gay and lesbian organizing took off in Russia with the appearance of a Russian national umbrella organization to unite local queer groups and the establishment of the Moscow Library of Lesbians and Gays. And there we are, great. This library collected all the print media queer publishers were producing at the time, opened a reading room in the capital to researchers and readers to borrow books and to do research, and powered up queer women's writing workshops. And you see some examples of the queer women's writing there with one of the founders of this archive, Yelena Gusitinskaya. On the eve of the digital revolution, a decade of freedom in the 1990s showed just how vibrant, serious, and independent Russia's LGBTQ activism could be. All of this took place, of course, against the backdrop of painful transitional economics, chaotic democracy under the feeble leadership of the once popular President Boris Yeltsin, and a long-running war against Moscow's rule in Chechnya. Russians who had lived in the Soviet state, where they felt supremely secure, now felt that their leaders had lost control. The stage was set for a strongman to end the democratic experiment. The democratic 1990s also came with an unregulated media landscape that offered a potential cluster of grievances for a shrewd political communicator to exploit. The old Soviet silence about sex, all kinds of sex, not just homosexuality, had been ripped up, and sex with Western consumerist features was used to sell absolutely everything. All sexuality was visible to Russians in an unprecedented way, a free-for-all. And the rise of digital media at the start of the 2000s frightened people who felt they were losing control of what they and their children should see. So let's turn to look at President Putin. President Boris Yeltsin's shock resignation on the last day of the 20th century catapulted the relatively unknown ex-KGB officer and now Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin into the presidency. He won a popular election in March 2000 with about 53% of the votes cast. Over the next 8 years, he sought to reinforce Russian statehood, suppress the tendency to greater local autonomy and separatism, and bring the war in Chechnya to a harsh and crushing conclusion. From Yeltsin's bumbling and drunk granddad image, Russians now had the leader they seemed to crave. Youthful, swaggering, sober, and unambiguously an alpha male. Putin's swagger and sometimes sweary demeanor connected with ordinary Russians who got and get their news from network television, which he brought to heel by forcing oligarchs to sell their stations and networks and putting allies on boards of directors. The president communicated with ordinary Russians visually as well, famously flying into the Chechen war zone in fighter pilot gear, and later photographed topless in the saddle, a macho man at home in Russia's boundless landscape. Gender historian Elizabeth Wood points to the rich mixture of types in Putin's masculine image. In these early years, when Putin's grasp on power relied on relatively free elections, he had a chameleon-like ability to cycle through moods and looks that kept audiences watching. The tough guy smashing the Chechens in the outhouse, the patriarchal boss man telling oligarchs to stay out of politics, the wealthy connoisseur of European suits and wines. For Elizabeth Wood, Putin's highly contrived image was all about power and legitimacy. Masculinity for Putin, she wrote, became a way of showing power without having to explain it. From the very start of his presidency, Putin expressed concern about Russia's severely declining population and poor birth rate, and at the same time, his political technologists explored how to connect with ordinary Russians who worried that support for families was long forgotten by the state. In the early years of the 21st century, there was a fair bit of experimentation in government policy here. Politicians staged campaigns in parliament, and the Kremlin launched grassroots projects to rally support for the president's family and birth rate theme. The result was a narrative which has now evolved into Putin's commitment to Russia's so-called traditional values. One of the first experiments was a conservative nationalist law on the defense of morality, proposed in Parliament in 2002. The law raised the age of consent from 14 to 16 years, made penalties for criminal sexual offenses harsher, and it penalized child pornography in Russian law for the first time. Putin signed it in 2003. During the parliamentary debate on this law, many voices condemned the post-1991 sexual revolution and its links to globalization and the digital revolution. Russia's traditional values as a political concept made their debut in this debate, which rallied politicians across the spectrum, medical experts worried about teenage sexuality, and nationalists who called for the repression of those who were, quote, destroying the gene pool of the nation, end quote. During parliamentary debates around this new law, one male MP made a serious proposal to restore Stalin's ban on male homosexuality. A law against what he called sodomy and pederasty would help the fight against venereal diseases and AIDS and save Russia from population decline. He said, sodomy is against the spirit of the Russian people. We're not in France. If someone wants to do this, let them move to France. He also suggested Holland as a second destination. Copycat proposals, obviously intended to win headlines, were tabled by other MPs, not to be outdone, to outlaw lesbian relations for the first time in Russian history, that would have been, and to impose fines for masturbation. All three draft laws were rejected without a vote, and some Russian MPs rose to defend the 1993 abolition of Stalin's anti-homosexual law on human rights grounds. But the headline-grabbing power of anti-LGBTQ themes and the link to traditional values aligned with the spirit of the Russian people that was distinct from European sexual libertinism was a powerful story that conservatives, nationalists, and ultimately Putin could not ignore. A return to Stalin's criminal penalties for homosexual acts was obviously impossible. Conservatives found they had to refine their anti-LGBTQ story. They turned to the problem of LGBTQ visibility and continued working on their political language, particularly at the level of local government. A minority of gay activists tried repeatedly to stage pride parades in Moscow in the first decade of the 21st century. Moscow's mayor and city council repeatedly refused to sanction these public events, and they became media circuses where tiny groups of queer people were jeered and beaten by nationalist and religious fanatics while the police looked on. The annual spectacle provoked vigorous debates about whether LGBTQ people in Russia should be seen in public at all, how they should live their lives, and whether they could be credible and loyal citizens of Russia. In this context, Russia's conservative politicians considered banning gay propaganda among minors or school children. Similar measures had originated most notoriously in Britain in 1988, Section 28, which was not repealed in England until 2003, and many were adopted and are still in effect at local and state level in the United States. Russia's regions served as testbeds for variations on the anti-propaganda law, offering conservatives opportunities to craft and adapt messages of political homophobia as they gauged local responses. In 2006, Ryazan province passed an ordinance banning propaganda for homosexualism among minors. Activists launched a legal challenge, and the Constitutional Court in January 2010 upheld the Ryazan gay propaganda law, and its decision embedded in Russian jurisprudence the tendentious concepts of traditional versus non-traditional marital relations, coded language for straight versus queer sex, which proved to be a useful formula. In 2011, and especially in 2012, regional assemblies around Russia rapidly adopted local versions of the gay propaganda law. This looked very much like coordinated activity, a political homophobic project inspired by Putin's advisors. The president's ruling party machines dominated regional government and elites. The local proposals were heralded by meetings of youth organizations, rallied in support of banning propaganda for homosexualism, lesbianism, bisexualism, transgenderism. That was usually the phrase that was found in these laws, among minors. Local LGBTQ community protests took place, but were of little use. In regional assemblies, the adoption of these gay propaganda bans was virtually unopposed. It's impossible to say with any certainty how involved the Kremlin was in producing this wave of official homophobic lawmaking. In enacting the national gay propaganda ban, President Putin later claimed his government was responding to a genuine public clamor. Indeed, from available sources, a varied picture emerges of local initiative and party coordination driving the local laws, and the geographic spread of the regional ordinances against gay propaganda suggests a resonance with the Russian provinces. So why escalate to a national ban on gay propaganda? In 2012, Vladimir Putin returned to the presidency after a 4-year hiatus required by the Russian constitution. His re-election was guaranteed by voting fraud schemes, which by then were deeply embedded in Russia's authoritarian electoral political system. By this stage in Russia's march to autocracy, parties inside Putin's system were getting seats in parliament and regional assemblies. A backstage algorithm of vote reallocation gave Russia's managed democracy the appearance of being open-ended and democratic. At this time, opposition parties and leaders outside Putin's system, like Alexei Navalny, doggedly pursued political office through elections. Seldom could they win, but their candidates attracted hundreds of thousands of urban voters, especially in Russia's biggest cities. The opposition in 2011 and 2012 mobilized hundreds of thousands of supporters in street protests and social media investigation against electoral fraud and the Putin system. Putin's assumption of a third presidential term did not go smoothly, and his official homophobia and anti-feminist campaigns emerged in this moment of instability. The punk feminist Pussy Riot protests against Putin's re-election in 2012 gave the president a stick to beat the opposition that was outside his system. They supposedly supported women infected by Western feminist gender ideology who blasphemed against the Russian Orthodox Church. Metropolitan hipsters might appreciate a punk feminist protest in a cathedral redolent of state power. But Russians in the regions were easily persuaded by the court trial of the Pussy Riot 3 that this disrespect and chaos was what a Russia ruled by the outsider opposition politicians would look like. The success of the anti-feminist campaign against the outsider opposition persuaded the Kremlin to deploy anti-LGBTQ campaigning. A distraction from economic woes, the year-long debate over the 2013 gay propaganda law that bans positive or neutral speech accessible to minors under 18 about LGBTQ identities, again smeared the outsider opposition as out of touch with the real Russia, with the country's traditional values. Politicians promoting the ban on what became propaganda for non-traditional values silenced the few brave liberal critics in parliament by saying that they represented the so-called pedophile lobby. In the end, only one MP voted against the law, and Putin quickly signed it in June 2013. This was a watershed moment that committed Putin's regime to developing its anti-LGBTQ narrative. The impact of the 2013 propaganda law was appalling, but it did the job Putin's advisors wanted it to do, discrediting the liberal outsider opposition and furnishing the media and public with tiny defenseless minorities, feminists and queer communities to vilify as disloyal to Russia and its traditional values. The law has been used in dozens of vexatious cases against Russian teachers, website editors, activists, drag queens, and foreign visitors. The 2013 debate about the law triggered greater violence against gay men and trans women in particular, with a big increase in homophobic murders and assaults tracked by scholars who study the courts and police. A major transformation of the gay propaganda law's value to the Kremlin emerged with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the launch of Russia's war with Ukraine in Donbass and Luhansk. Putin found the international reception of the homophobic law annoying to navigate at first. Troublesome media confrontations in the Netherlands in 2013 let them go to the Holland, tricky messaging around the Sochi Olympics in early 2014. The Kremlin began searching for support internationally, finding allies for its vocal homophobia among authoritarian conservative countries in the Middle East and Asia, in the United Nations and in other human rights forums. This was a soft power gain for Putin that raised Russia's profile and offered channels of influence. The Vatican's campaign against gender ideology and US evangelical Protestant conservatives offered Russian homophobic diplomacy, global allies in Latin America, in Africa, in the USA, and in Europe. The conflict with Ukraine and the occupation of Crimea in 2014 freed Putin to stop pretending, as he had for the Sochi Olympics, that the law was merely a domestic child protection measure of minor significance. He embraced a vigorously anti-Western narrative that LGBTQ values were false values, entirely alien to Russia, opposing traditional Russian values that supposedly conform to human nature. His media commentators framed Ukraine's 2014 revolution of dignity as Ukraine surrendering to gay-Europa. The EU and NATO were said to be telling this anti-Russia, Ukraine, on Moscow's doorstep to accept gay rights, same-sex marriage and adoption, and pride parades. Looking now at the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's turn against its LGBTQ citizens. Well, the consequences of the full-scale invasion in 2022 have been catastrophic for Ukraine's citizens. But the adversity has forged a determined Ukrainian resolve to repulse the aggressor. A little noticed casualty of this war has been the LGBTQ community in Russia, which has come under even harsher attacks from the state. Putin has signed a second gay propaganda law, and even more ominous is a presidential decree that weaponizes traditional values. With the failure of Russia's original 3 days to Kyiv scenario, a long grinding war with negligible gains from Moscow ensued. The conflict has consumed Russian lives at a pace that would have been scarcely credible just years ago. In the 9 years of the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, 15,000 Soviet army soldiers died. And the most conservative reckoning by independent Russian journalists about the Ukraine war since 2022 has reached the same figure in just 1 year of this war. By Western official estimates, the toll is more like 3 or 4 times that. And if you add casualties, that's another 150,000 losses to the Russian side. Another loss are the hundreds of thousands who have quit Russia since 24 February 2022. Facing failure on the battlefield, in late September 2022, Putin ordered a further mobilization of 300,000 reservists, triggering more emigration from Russia of young men of service age. Conservative estimates of population loss to Russia by emigration of those disaffected by the war and men avoiding military call-up runs between 700,000 and over 1 million. The battleground failures and the brain and brawn drain from Russia required a response from the Kremlin. One of the many attempts to regain ground was to target familiar scapegoats. In autumn 2022, the Russian state renewed the attack on LGBTQ citizens. First, a second, harsher and broader law against propaganda for non-traditional sexual relations was quickly introduced in Parliament and signed into law on the 5th of December 2022. This intensified propaganda law extends the first 2013 ban on such propaganda in several ways. It bans speech about LGBTQ issues among adults as well as minors. It adds unprecedented prohibitions on transgender issues, and it lists the various media that are subject to this sweeping ban and raises penalties. Now, any neutral or positive mention of LGBTQ issues in print, online, on social media, and in radio, television, film, streaming services, etc., will convene the new law. The new law extends the ban to distribution of any movies or advertisements showing LGBTQ people or scenarios. The new law adds a ban on any mention of transgender identity or change of gender in front of minors. Violators can be fined up to £65,000, and foreigners who break the law can be jailed and then deported. Jail time for Russian violators is coming in new legislation. It's hard to see how any public speech about LGBTQ existence will not fall foul of this vague law. Moscow's libraries and bookshops have already compiled lists of banned LGBTQ-themed literature, including works by Stephen Fry and many Russian authors. Legal proceedings have started against a pair of queer novelists, Lena Malisova and Katya Silvanova, who particularly annoyed homophobic lawmakers. In 2021, Malisova and Silvanova published hugely popular novels, not very good ones, I must say, Summer in a Young Pioneer's Tie, and its sequel, What the Swallow Won't Say. In these works of fiction, two boys fall in love in a Ukrainian Soviet summer camp in 1986, and then they experience the damage that Soviet-era homophobia inflicts. Politicians looking for a pretext for the second propaganda law raised an outcry against the novelists and their publisher. Last month, the Russian state declared the authors foreign agents, a designation that surrounds them in a bureaucratic nightmare of restrictions, making any kind of professional activity impossible for them inside Russia. The second prong of the Russian state's attack on LGBTQ citizens is a new presidential decree of the 9th of November, 2022. The decree on state policy to preserve and strengthen traditional Russian spiritual moral values. With it, Putin has declared the protection of so-called traditional values a core state objective, unifying an array of scattered Kremlin policies enacted since 2012 and articulating the logic of a homophobic and transphobic national security regime. The decree defines non-traditional sexual relations as among the most destructive values attacking the traditional Russian family. It requires all state agencies to review their policies to align them with traditional values. It also declares that Russians who embody or promote non-traditional values are security threats, allied to extremist and terrorist organizations and to the actions of the United States of America and other unfriendly foreign states. The potential for harassment of ordinary LGBTQ citizens on the basis of this law is obvious and is already being seen in the sharp rise in applications for asylum from Russian lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people in the UK and the West more generally. The potential for pogroms and human rights abuses against Russia's LGBTQ citizens is accelerating. And some final thoughts, and I'll wrap up. Without formally criminalizing LGBTQ sexual activity or diversity of gender identity, the Russian state has rendered living a livable LGBTQ life in Russia impossible. By including all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer speech in the new ban and throwing a cloud of disloyalty and potential treason over any activity of LGBTQ citizens, Putin has outstripped Stalin in the scope for homophobic and transphobic persecution now available to the Russian state. These laws dramatically extend Stalin's Soviet-era official homophobia in force from 1933 to 1993, which was confined to the criminalization of male homosexual acts. Stalin never enacted laws to target lesbians, bisexuals, or transgender people. In the midst of a wartime disaster of his own making, President Putin has set his sights on driving LGBTQ citizens underground, ordering the entire state to be on the lookout for treasonous queers. The persecution of LGBTQ Russians has expanded as Russian democracy has withered. Russia's democratic future died absolutely in January last year. In preparation for his invasion of Ukraine, Putin finally stamped out the one independent organization in Russia with great moral authority would have spoken against the atrocities and war crimes he planned. In January 2022, the Memorial Society, founded in 1987 to commemorate the victims of Stalinism and Soviet state terror, was formally shut down by a Moscow court. This genuinely Russian, national, and grassroots non-governmental institution was speciously declared a foreign agent and ordered to disband. It is a historical fact that no leader of the Soviet Union or Russia since Stalin's death in 1953 has done more to falsify and embellish Stalin's reputation than Vladimir Putin. Using resentment at Russian misfortune and misrule and loss of superpower prestige, the Putin regime and its supporters have distorted and trampled on historical memory of the country's tragedies and the tragedy inflicted on nations under the Soviet boot. Whatever the outcome of this war in Ukraine, and whatever becomes of Putin and his regime, there can be no peaceful Russian future without a return to a rational reassessment of the Soviet past. That includes, in at least some small way, reconsideration of the damage inflicted on generations of gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, and trans people by Stalinist and now Putinist state violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nan. I've been asked to chair some questions for 20-30 minutes, so I'm sure there are many of them, so please hands up with the questions and maybe we'll take 2 or 3.
Big question. What next? What's the future? How do we stop this?
I'm going to gather questions or just take that.
Yeah, that's the only one.
Well, okay. I'm a historian. So I'm looking at the rear view mirror, not at the future, and it's really hazardous for historians to predict the future. What I can say with some certainty, first of all, it's absolutely the case that both societies, both Russia and Ukraine, will change as a result of this war. And how that plays out depends on how long this war is and what the outcome of that is, I think. But I think we can certainly see more militarization. Ukrainians have been anxious about militarization of their society for the last decade, really. As part of the post-Revolution of Dignity, post-2014 attacks on the Donbass and Luhansk regions, the annexation of Crimea, Ukrainian LGBT activists certainly expressed this to me very strongly when I did field work in Kyiv in the years before 2022. So I have the impression that that will be a continuing area of concern. And obviously, a society that is holding off Russia, that's that much smaller, that much less a force will be transformed utterly by that experience. I think that's one thing I can certainly say. The other thing I can say with some certainty is that so many LGBT activists have left Russia. A whole generation of interesting people have left Russia who were involved in the LGBTQ community and in self-help groups, not so much in publishing, website publishing, I suppose, and mostly in inward-looking, community-facing endeavors of one kind or another. Those people are now in Georgia. They're now in a dozen different places around Russia. They've been forced to leave the country. And I think they're going to bring interesting developments in those countries in terms of thinking about the LGBTQ futures of those countries as well as Russia. So that's my dare to predict.
Thanks very much, Dan. So after a very big question, if I could ask something a little bit more specific, and this comes from ignorance, I'm afraid. But I was wondering about the relationship between gay people and the military in Russia historically, and whether or not gay people can join the military, and whether there have been any changes in perceptions of that as a result of conflict in any way.
It's a great question, and the short answer is there's so little research on this, and it's such a dangerous topic to research. I mean, even exploring what has happened in the past in the Soviet military of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, etc., is very difficult, and you'll find very little scholarship in any language on it. There was, in the sort of democratic interval between sort of 87 and 2000, 2005, a small wave of anthropological studies of the Russian army that included a certain amount of research about sexuality and quite a large amount of research on hazing, on the hazing culture, which is called Dedovshchina in Russian, or the rule of the grandfathers, basically. And there's a system of hierarchy where the longest serving conscripts got to lord it over the newest intake, basically. You went through 4 stages in your sort of career of Dedovshchina. So there's quite a lot of research on that because it was a major problem in the post-Soviet Russian army. But we know very little really about the relationship between homosexuality and the Russian army. We know that Peter the Great banned sodomy in 1716 in the army and made it a crime for soldiers. And we know that Nicholas I in 1832-35 extended that military ban to civilian society. There's certainly more to learn about this, and there's certainly a deep well of homophobia there, undoubtedly. It's a single-sex army, all male, and it is in many ways a total institution that resembles the Gulag in terms of barracks life, in terms of forced labor, and so on, and the kinds of semi-criminalized male-male violent relations that prevailed in the Gulag also, I think, are anecdotally known to exist in the Soviet army and the Russian army as well. But thank you for the question.
One question, maybe a little bit silly, but you touched on the social ban on people speaking out about LGBT. Can you see the younger generation, a bit like across the globe, people ignoring the penalties and just more and more demonstrations creeping in to Russia and sodden Putin, and just more and more meetings in the square and stuff, and fighting and an uprising, so to speak, and protecting what they believe in. Can you see that happening, or do you just see them just going underground and staying as it is?
I think it depends how old you are.
Yeah.
You know, I think it depends on what you have to lose and what you want your future to be. So I do think younger people are probably more likely to protest. You know, political scientists would know far more about this than I do. But the other thing about this is that this new law, which bans pretty much all speech about LGBTQ in Russia, is going to produce a kind of whack-a-mole effect. You know, the prosecutors are going to be so busy with this that it's just going to break down, I think, and it'll be used, like a lot of Russian legislation, for vexatious and secondary purposes. We don't like this person over here, they're a bit too independent, so let's pin that on them. Let's find a tweet or something they said on Russian Wikipedia or what have you, that we can pin to them, and we'll take them down that way. So I think that that's one major part of them.
I just compare it with the thing that happened in Hong Kong and China. With, that's a communist country, you know, very strict. At the end of the day, but they didn't give a damn. They still went to the streets. And I can see that happening, you know, with people not caring about the consequences and just having a growing uprising.
Well, the one thing about Russian history is that when it changes seismically, you know, over a very short space of time. But it does take time for that pressure to build up. And one of the unfortunate effects of so many people leaving the country is that that pressure isn't there from the people who are most capable of organizing it. Or most motivated to organize it. Those people are now outside the country. But you know, another wave of mobilization, for example, if the Kremlin declared another wave of mobilization, there were already violent protests against that first mobilization in September. There were over at least 75 cases of people firebombing recruitment offices in the regions of Russia. Not much of that got reported here, but it was pretty shocking in terms of people taking up arms against their own government. Thanks.
Thanks. I've got a question about what you think the role of social media is in Russia and internationally. You started off with saying about the current wave of anti-trans sentiment, particularly in this country. A lot of that has, I would think there's a lot of social media influence of that, maybe some of it isn't overtly Russian. Yeah. How do you feel, what do you think the role of social media in Russia or outside Russia about LGBTQ issues is going to be down the line? Do you think that plays an important role, or do you think that's by the by, so to speak?
I guess my first thought about it is that it is, again, generational. That, I mean, you have an older generation, mostly dying off now, who gets almost all of their information from broadcast television, from the big networks that the Kremlin owns and dominates. The problem for the Kremlin looking ahead, and here we go into the future a bit, is that younger people get more and more of their information away from those sources, and they're very alive to the techniques necessary in order to get round. There's no great Russian firewall, but there are restrictions on the use of certain sites like Twitter and so on, and so they're Russian analogs for many of these sites. For example, I have friends in Russia who still use WhatsApp because they know how to manipulate VPNs, and so they're very relevant. I think social media networks and social media political techniques and ways of organizing. The problem then is getting traction that actually translates into some kind of political change, if that's the goal. Because as we've seen with social media based protests, in places like Hong Kong, in Tunisia, and in the Middle East, for example, they have a tendency to fizzle out because they're not centrally controlled or have like a clear sort of focus or a clear sort of set of political aims. And that's a difficulty. But it is going to be a problem for the leadership of Russia, whoever that is, looking ahead. The only way that the Russian economy can prosper in the future is to become more tech savvy, not less tech savvy. So it actually has to embrace the new media in some fashion or other and make that work for a new economy, because you cannot depend on oil and gas forever, obviously.
Good question.
Yeah, it's still a question about the future, sorry. Where does Putin go in his anti-Western bullshit? When the West are also doing exactly what he's doing. So when the different US states are also banning neutral speech by trans people or by people in drag, and when the UK are also throwing away devolution by throwing in contestations to Scottish legal reform. Where does Putin go when they all agree with him?
Well, then I guess he becomes the leader of some kind of unfree world, doesn't he? The story I told tonight was really focused on just Russia, but in fact, you're quite right that there is a parallel development in the rest of in the West and in many other countries that is going in the same authoritarian and illiberal direction. That is in part something that we have imported from Putin and the brains around him, and partially something that we've developed ourselves and in fact exported to Putin and his advisors. I mean, there's an unholy kind of circulation of these forms of knowledge that I alluded to when I talked about the Vatican and its gender ideology campaigns, and US evangelical Christians with their sort of take on how homosexuality should play out in Nigeria, for example. I mean, the examples are endless. So Putin gains traction when we give those politicians power. The Conservative Party of this country benefits, it seems to me, from the rise of this kind of transphobic language in a place like Russia and its export to other parts of the world. You know, a political figure like Donald Trump will only prosper as Putin prospers. And so we have a task ahead of us, I think, to preserve whatever democracy and freedom we enjoy, regardless of what you might think about, you know, the politics of the arguments between feminists and some trans people about what's compatible and what's not compatible. We have to be having that in a democratic space, and we have to be having that in a respectful space, and that cannot be compatible with Putin's politics and with the politics of his allies in the West.
When some of those debates are compatible with respect and compatible with democracy, right?
That's it. I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge that, and we have to see that for what it is.
How unpopular is the implementation of these implementations on the LGBTQ community? I mean, it's quite evident from the people that are leaving Russia. But has there been much research into sort of quantifying that? I mean, Putin won with a 3% majority, but I mean, he's changed significantly since then.
It's really difficult actually to quantify this. It's hard for independent sociologists to work in Russia now, as Cease has been talking about quite a bit, I think, here in the new Center for Eastern European and Eurasian Studies, right? So this is actually methodologically a really difficult problem because it's no longer possible to commission the kinds of surveys, to hire people in the way that was possible even just a few years ago, to do various kinds of polling and to get that kind of deep quantitative data about people's attitudes. And instead, what scholars in the West are relying on more and more are small qualitative samples. And what they seem to indicate is that there's a certain amount of traction. Is it Jeremy Morris in this series, not the Stonewall Lecture, but in the Cease series, who mentioned recently that the anti-LGBTQ narrative that Putin's putting out has a lot of traction with educated urban Russians of a certain age and with a certain sort of stake in the current regime, in the economy, in their own sort of household prosperity. And he says that they recognize in this something about the preservation of a unique Russian form of civilization, which is an idea that's always been there in the Russian mind for centuries, and has developed in various ways over time and ebbed and flowed as Russia's sense of exceptionalism has ebbed and flowed. And as Russia's sense of internationalism has ebbed and flowed, as its imperialism has ebbed and flowed. But that sense that Russia is a civilization on its own, of a distinctive type, is something that they can identify with, and that many of them feel justifies this anti-LGBTQ narrative. And of course, if they don't know anyone or if their family members who are LGBTQ are concealing themselves or hiding, then there's no harm in it, is there?
Yeah, I suppose there's been quite a bit of confusion in the country because of, like I said, because of the open play, but because of the legalization, then the non-legalization, and it's then getting legalized again with homosexuality. I mean, it's happened all across the 20th century. And I suppose would that have instilled some sort of confusion amongst the population in their beliefs?
I think what I can say about that, to answer that, is that there's never been an adequate public discussion that has looked at these matters in a considered way over a long space of time. There was never a Wolfenden Commission that sat down and said, oh, let's decriminalize sodomy. In 1922, bang, they just did it. And it was part of the revolutionary download from, in fact, revolutionary France in 1791. They decriminalized sodomy, and then all revolutionary regimes after that should decriminalize sodomy and incest and heresy and all the other churchy sort of crimes that existed before the French Revolution. So they never had that public conversation about what that meant. They didn't even have a conversation among communists before the revolution about what this meant. One of the great gaps in LGBTQ historical research is trying to understand the relationship between the socialist movement of Europe of the 19th and early 20th centuries and LGBT activism at that time, and trying to understand where the ideas came from, who circulated them, what they consisted of, and what impact they had. Harry White's letter to Stalin is a really critical piece of evidence because it's one of the very few catalogs of those ideas that we actually have. And that was hidden in an archive until 1993. So there hasn't been that kind of public conversation. The first time there was a genuine public conversation about the status of LGBT people in Russia was actually that 2002 debate in Parliament. and then the 2013 debate over the gay propaganda law. And those are very negative scenarios for staging a debate. And they took place in a society where very few people were out. Very few public figures dared to come out. Very few public figures, politicians, even artists, dancers in the ballet, et cetera, were known to be gay and spoke about it proudly. So the nature of the quality of the public conversation really, I think, matters here. Thanks for the question.
We've got the online audience.
I'll take some online questions, just a few for you. So this one's from Talia Collett. It says, thank you for the lecture. You mentioned the emigration of Russian men eligible for conscription. We've also seen a drop in the Russian birth rates and the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic in Russia. Do you think that this population decline could be a contributing factor for future worsening homophobia?
Thank you, Talia, for that question, and a big shout to you in Tbilisi. I think it's a really important problem, isn't it? That the drop in that sort of working age male population, and remembering again that the Russian army is an all-male army, is a particular worry and concern for the state. It was in 2000 when Putin came to power, and now, with even ever more diminishing reserves of population in those important age cohorts. I think there's, a cause and effect there, and there definitely does seem like there would be more homophobia in the future. But again, I emphasize I'm a historian, Talia, not a social scientist like you. So I'm not going to predict the future, but thank you for the question.
Go for another one, yeah? There's more. Helen Harding, how far would you agree that Putin has used the shift of power from church to government to use traditional values to reinforce gender stereotypes, limit the rights of the individual to question government, and increase the birth rate as he deems a necessity?
Well, I think that Putin has really strengthened the alliance between the church and the state. And a little backstory here is necessary. In the Soviet period, of course, officially, the state was atheistic and the state was separated from the church violently, with the church being suppressed, often violently. And that came to an end in the 1980s and the 1990s as the state liberalized. When communism collapsed, politicians in Russia looked for other ways of talking about the state and other ideologies to fill that big gap of ideology. Ideology supplied the thousands and hundreds and thousands of words that justified state activity in the old Soviet Union. And that was a big loss, actually, for politicians. They cast about desperately, actually, in the 1990s, looking for a new reason for Russia, a new sort of purpose for Russia, if you like. And consumer capitalism just didn't hit the right notes. And something about Russia's civilization and its historic mission has more traction and feels better from the Russian popular perspective. The church, because like all Orthodox churches, is a national church, so it's an alternative embodiment of the nation for very many Russians. Of course, Russia is a multi-confessional country. It's not just Orthodox, but also has 10% of its population is Muslim. It has many Protestants and many other Christian denominations and so on. But the Russian Orthodox Church has been very important as a support for a new state idea, if you like, since Putin's rise to power. And it's quite interesting, if you look at that 2002 debate in Parliament, It was very unchurchy, it was very unreligious. It was all about medicine and science and what the doctors say about what's appropriate sexuality for teenagers and that sort of thing. But it did not wheel out a lot of churchmen to talk about morality. This is much more a focus of Putin's return to power after 2012, that the church is more closely aligned to the state, probably a lot more dependent on the state. The sort of back channels by which the church and the state communicate aren't well known, but they are studied by some scholars. Again, it's a bit like the military problem. It's hard to get in there. And at the same time, it's pretty obvious from what the church says and does that it is actually, as the questioner asks, having quite an important say on gender issues, on family relations, on the birth rate, on all of these really important matters.
We've got one in the audience here. If you could come back to the audience.
I can't show.
It's just for our home audience, yeah, rather than here.
I'm just curious to hear your insight on the particular piece of propaganda that seems to think Nazism and LGBTQ people are somehow in cahoots in Ukraine. Is that something that's very recent, or in your research that's been around for a long time? Because naturally the two don't mix historically.
It's an interesting question, and actually there's a whole branch of scholarship that looks at the relationship between Nazism and other far-right sort of political movements, and particularly gay male sexuality. So there is scholarship that looks at the early Nazi movement where there was more overt homosexuality, and that sort of built a reputation that propagandists ever since have used against fascism with some profit. And in fact, Stalin used that. His propagandists in the 1930s talked about how if you destroy the homosexuals, fascism will disappear. That's an actual slogan from Soviet newspapers of the time. So that sort of linkage was always there. And indeed, our countries used that same linkage in propaganda against the Nazis during the Second World War as well. It was a bit on the extreme side of the sort of propaganda. It was a bit gonzo, but people did explore that theme in works that you can still find in musty bookshops. So that trope has been lying around in the gutter waiting to be picked up again. And what I haven't talked about is actually the change in LGBTQ politics in Ukraine, partially as a result of this war. There are now openly gay, lesbian, and trans soldiers in the Ukrainian army, and they have their own website, and they have their own social media, and they are supporting each other, and they are finding supportive officers in the Ukrainian army, and it's really happening in real time, that revolution. Thousands of Ukrainians petitioned the government, arguing that the state should recognize same-sex partnerships, should equalize marriage. And Zelensky had to respond to that last summer, and he responded pretty positively for a country that has very little experience of dealing with this and very little knowledge of its own history yet, where these things are concerned. So I think that that is a work in progress, where things are happening. The idea that somehow the Ukrainian state is Nazi is absolutely lunacy, is a delusion, and what is happening in Ukraine is its own revolution, its own development, frankly. It's part of the transformations that are coming out of this war that will be interesting to follow in the future.
Maybe got time for one last one on the.
Okay. So this is from Connor Doak. What practical steps might we scholars take to decolonize Russian and Soviet queer history, especially seeing it is so difficult to access Russia and its archives at the moment?
This is why I retired. It's the methodological dilemma of our age. I think one of the obvious things to do, and the swerve that I'm trying to undertake, is to study more the non-Russian republics and to think more systematically about their histories as independent histories, and to take that seriously. I mean, if I sort of, Connor's a specialist in Russian gender studies in language and literature department, and I trained as a language and literature specialist in the Russian language in the 1970s and the early 1980s. Everything we were taught was Moscow-centric. Everything we were taught was focused on Moscow and on the Great Russian Republic, and it became the sort of default setting of my brain for 50 years. I learned Russian alongside Ukrainian Canadians, but never asked them about their language. Assumed it was pretty corrupted because they probably learned it third hand from, I think they were fourth generation Ukrainians, and they were, and they had an advantage because they already knew a Slavic language. They were rivals in a certain sense. I have had, since this war started, to think much more sympathetically about Ukraine than I did before. And I have had to think much more creatively about how one would do this history without the access to Russian archives that we've enjoyed up until a year or two ago. And I'm not alone in that. The whole profession is struggling with that question. In some respects, we're returning to the kind of research environment we had during the Cold War, when access to the object of research, the Soviet Union, was not possible or was limited and distorted in various ways, more accurately. But I think as well that one of the things that this new generation has to do is to pick up not just Russian, but other languages, which is why I'm learning Georgian and trying, I think, to diversify the perspectives that I'm using in my work. But, that'll be a life's work.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're bumping against the end of the 2-hour session here, unless there are, George, any...
There's one more question online.
One more.
Yeah.
Let's have the last one.
Okay. Right. So, M asks, Ukraine now has a large diaspora living in Europe and Canada, many of whom are experiencing different cultures and approaches to LGBTQ lives and rights, many of which are different to Russia's rhetoric. What impact do you think this will have on Putin's aims?
Well, I think that the key point there, I guess, is that influence from other countries with different approaches to these questions. And one of the things we know from, for example, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, is that when the wall came down, many diaspora populations from Canada and the United States and European countries, from Australia, returned to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and had a huge impact on the way those countries developed in the post-socialist phase. Same thing true, I think, of you could say, of Poland and other Central and East European countries that had been socialist and more or less closed and that had diaspora populations abroad. So I think we're going to see the same thing. But Ukraine has the luxury of several waves of diaspora, starting in the 19th century. That those Ukrainian Canadians that I studied Russian with were fourth or fifth generation, third or fourth or fifth generation Ukrainians whose great-grandparents had emigrated in the 19th century. to Western Canada and the early 20th century to Canada. There are Ukrainians in Brazil from that time period. There are Ukrainians all over the world who've come to new homelands at different points across the 20th century. So I think what you're going to see is different layers of influence that will have an impact on Ukraine during and after this war, that will be, again, interesting to watch and important pieces of the puzzle of what Ukraine becomes.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm going to hand over to Julie Gallen to say a word of thanks. And just before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that there's a seminar tomorrow, also connected with CEAS, that addresses some of these Ukrainian-Russian decolonization of Ukrainian-Russian history questions. So you're very welcome.
Can you give the microphone to Julie?
Well, I'm sure you can probably all agree that being given the job of following such a fascinating, rich and timely lecture that Dan has given us this evening is a pretty impossible task. So I'm really pleased that all I have to do is say thank you to everyone involved. As part of the history department here at Southampton, one of the things we always stress is the importance of studying the past in order to be able to understand the world that we live in today. And I think tonight's lecture has shown us completely how that can be done and how so crucial an exercise it is for us all to undertake when we're carrying out historical research. So I'd like to very much thank Dan for his fascinating lecture this evening on behalf of all of us, and obviously that's where my biggest thank you goes. But in addition to that, there are a few other people that I need to thank this evening. We'd also like to thank Louise Johnson for her expert organisation of this overall event, and to Katie for your help this evening, and indeed Grace as our student ambassador. It really is much appreciated. And the other really important person to thank here is Professor Mark Cornwall, who spoke at the beginning of the lecture and was involved in the setting up of the Stonewall Lecture, as I said, 12 years ago. And I think, again, we can see a fantastic example of just what an important series this has become for Southampton. And it's a very great pleasure for us to be able to combine that this year also with CEAS, the new centre. And thank you to Charlie and George for your involvement this evening as well. Final thing to say, as Mark mentioned at the beginning, there are flyers with discount vouchers on for Dan's book at the front here, so please do take one if you don't already have a copy of Dan's book. And as you vacate the room, if you follow round to the right-hand side, there are refreshments available, and I'm sure Dan will be happy to answer any follow-up questions over a glass of something round